Imagine being 7 years old, standing on a train platform, when a man in a crisp uniform points at you and your twin brother. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you share the same DNA. Within hours, you're strapped to a table while someone injects chemicals into your eyes, trying to change their color. This wasn't some twisted science fiction movie. This was real life at Auschwitz concentration camp, where Josef Mengele turned identical twins into his personal laboratory rats. What he discovered through torture would haunt the survivors forever. But it also revealed something terrifying about how far humans will go in the name of science. The year was 1943, and Josef Mengele had just arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He wasn't just another SS officer. This man held a doctorate in medicine and another in anthropology. He came with a mission that would make him one of history's most notorious war criminals. But to understand why he became obsessed with twins, we need to understand what drove him. Mengele believed he could unlock the secrets of genetics by studying identical twins. His logic was simple but deadly. Take two people with identical DNA, subject one to experiments, keep the other as a comparison, and you could supposedly determine which traits were genetic versus environmental. The Nazi regime was desperate to prove their theories about racial superiority, and Mengele saw twins as his ticket to scientific fame. Born in 1911 to a wealthy Bavarian family, Mengele grew up surrounded by privilege. His father owned a successful farm machinery business, and Joseph was expected to follow in his footsteps. Instead, he chose medicine and anthropology, earning his degrees from prestigious German universities. By the time he joined the Nazi Party in 1937, he was already fascinated by genetic research and racial theories that would later fuel his crimes. When transport trains arrived at Auschwitz, most prisoners faced immediate selection for death or forced labor. But twins experienced something different. As families were torn apart and people were herded toward their fate, Mengele would walk the platform calling out a single word that would seal their destiny: Zwillinge, twins. The selection process was methodical and terrifying. Mengele would examine arriving prisoners with the eye of a scientist hunting for specimens. He looked for physical similarities between children, checking facial features, height, and build. Sometimes he would separate children who weren't actually twins, convinced by superficial resemblances. Other times he would reject actual twins if they didn't meet his standards for experimentation. Children who heard this call were immediately separated from their parents. They had no idea that this moment would save them from the gas chambers, only to subject them to something arguably worse. These twins, some as young as 5 years old, were housed in special barracks with slightly better food and living conditions. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like mercy. In reality, Mengele was simply keeping his test subjects healthy enough for experimentation. The twin barracks were located in a separate section of the camp, away from the main prisoner population. Children slept on wooden bunks with thin mattresses and received marginally better meals than other prisoners. They were given numbers tattooed on their arms like all prisoners, but their treatment was distinctly different. Guards were instructed to keep them alive and relatively healthy, creating an atmosphere of false security that made the coming experiments even more traumatic. Eva and Miriam Moses were 10 years old when they arrived at Auschwitz, Hungarian twins who had been living normal lives just weeks before. Eva later described how Mengele would visit their barracks, examining them like livestock. He measured their heads, limbs, and facial features with scientific precision. Every detail was recorded, every measurement catalogued. They were no longer children with names and dreams. They had become specimens. The daily routine for twin prisoners was unlike anything else in the camp. They were awakened early for medical examinations that could last for hours. Mengele would arrive with his assistants, armed with measuring tools, cameras, and notebooks. Children would be forced to stand naked while every part of their bodies was measured and documented. Height, weight, head circumference, facial angles, limb proportions, nothing was overlooked in this systematic cataloging of human genetic variation. The experiments began gradually. Blood draws became routine. Injections followed. Then came procedures that no medical textbook would ever describe as ethical. Mengele would inject chemicals directly into children's eyes, hoping to change their color from brown to blue. The pain was excruciating. Many children went blind. Others developed severe infections that left them permanently disfigured. These eye experiments were based on Mengele's belief that eye color was a simple genetic trait that could be altered through chemical intervention. He would inject methylene blue, silver nitrate, and other substances directly into children's eyes, often without any form of anesthesia. Children would scream and thrash as the chemicals burned their corneas and damaged their retinas. Some lost vision immediately, while others experienced gradual blindness over days or weeks. But the eye experiments were just the beginning. Mengele's obsession with genetics led him to perform forced blood transfusions between twins, even between opposite sexes. He believed he could artificially alter their biological characteristics. Children who had shared a womb were now sharing contaminated blood that their bodies would reject, causing fever, pain, and often death. The blood transfusion experiments were particularly brutal because they often involved large volumes of blood being exchanged between twins. Mengele would drain blood from one child and inject it into their sibling, sometimes repeatedly over several days. The children's bodies would reject the foreign blood, causing high fevers, convulsions, and immune system failures. Many twins died from these procedures, their small bodies unable to handle the shock of repeated blood exchanges. The surgical experiments became increasingly brutal. Healthy limbs were amputated without anesthesia. Urinary tracts were surgically altered. Genitals were manipulated in ways that caused permanent damage. Some twins were infected with typhus or other diseases just to study how their identical immune systems would respond differently under various conditions. One particularly horrifying set of experiments involved attempting to create conjoined twins through surgical procedures. Mengele would sew children together at various points on their bodies, hoping to create artificial conjoined twins that he could study. These operations were performed without proper surgical equipment or sanitary conditions, leading to severe infections and agonizing deaths for the children involved. If you're finding this content valuable and want to learn more about history's darkest chapters, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Mengele's work was how he maintained the facade of legitimate medical research. He kept meticulous records, took photographs, and wrote detailed reports as if he were conducting normal scientific studies. But behind the clinical documentation lay pure sadism. Survivors described how Mengele would sometimes appear kind, bringing candy or small toys to the children before subjecting them to agonizing procedures. Mengele's documentation was extensive and methodical. He photographed every stage of his experiments, from initial examinations through the final autopsies. His assistants would take detailed notes on procedures, reactions, and outcomes. Blood samples were carefully labeled and stored. Tissue samples were preserved for later study. This systematic approach gave his work the appearance of legitimate scientific research, which helped him avoid suspicion from other camp officials and visiting inspectors. The psychological manipulation was as calculated as the physical torture. Mengele would often present himself as a caring doctor, speaking softly to children and offering small treats before procedures. He would tell them that the experiments were necessary for their health, that he was trying to help them. This false kindness made the subsequent torture even more traumatic, as children never knew whether each interaction would bring relief or agony. György Kun and his brother István were Hungarian twins who survived Mengele's experiments. György lived to be 93, but he never forgot the trauma. He described how Mengele would examine them for hours, measuring every part of their bodies, taking blood samples, and performing procedures that left them weak and terrified. The brothers survived because they were mistakenly identified as twins when they weren't actually identical, but they still endured months of experimentation. The Kun brothers' experience illustrates how arbitrary and unscientific Mengele's selection process could be. They were brought to his attention because of their similar ages and physical builds, despite not being twins. Once selected, they were subjected to the same routine of measurements, blood draws, and experimental procedures as actual twins. Their survival was partly due to luck and partly due to the protection of other prisoners who helped them avoid the most dangerous experiments. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical abuse. Children watched their twin siblings deteriorate and die, knowing they might be next. Some experiments involved deliberately infecting one twin with a disease while keeping the other healthy, creating a living comparison study. The healthy twin would be forced to watch their sibling suffer, knowing that their own turn was coming. This psychological warfare was deliberate and systematic. Mengele understood that fear was a powerful tool for controlling his subjects. Children who witnessed their twins being tortured would become more compliant, hoping to avoid similar treatment. The constant threat of pain and death created an atmosphere of terror that made resistance nearly impossible. Zvi Spiegel was a prisoner who worked in Mengele's laboratory. He witnessed the daily horrors and tried to protect the twin children whenever possible. Spiegel would falsify records, hide children during selections, and provide extra food when he could. His story, featured in documentaries about the twin experiments, shows how even in the darkest places, some people fought to preserve humanity. Spiegel's resistance efforts were small but significant. He would sometimes switch blood samples to protect children from harmful injections. He would hide sick children during medical examinations, knowing that illness often led to immediate execution. He would share his own food rations with the twins, helping them maintain the strength needed to survive. His actions saved dozens of lives, though he was never able to stop the experiments entirely. When experiments were complete, Mengele would often kill both twins simultaneously to perform comparative autopsies. He wanted to study how their identical organs had responded differently to his interventions. On one documented night, he killed 14 twins by injecting chloroform directly into their hearts. Some reports suggest he fed them sleeping drugs first, a small mercy in an ocean of cruelty. The autopsy procedures were as systematic as the live experiments. Mengele would dissect both twins simultaneously, comparing their organs side by side. He would examine their brains, hearts, livers, and other organs for any differences that might have resulted from his experiments. These autopsies were photographed and documented in detail, creating a macabre archive of his work. The scientific value of these experiments was essentially zero. Mengele's methods were so fundamentally flawed that any results would be meaningless to legitimate researchers. He was torturing children based on pseudoscientific theories about race and genetics that had no basis in actual science. The Nazi ideology that drove these experiments was built on lies, and the research methods were designed to confirm predetermined conclusions rather than discover truth. Modern geneticists and medical ethicists have analyzed Mengele's work and found it to be completely without scientific merit. His understanding of genetics was primitive and often incorrect. His experimental methods lacked proper controls, his sample sizes were too small for meaningful conclusions, and his data collection was biased toward confirming Nazi racial theories. The suffering he caused produced no useful knowledge that could benefit humanity. Eva Moses Kor survived the experiments and later founded the Candles Holocaust Museum. She spent decades speaking about her experiences, but perhaps most remarkably, she publicly forgave Mengele. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she refused to let hatred continue poisoning her life. She described looking into Mengele's eyes and seeing nothing but evil, yet she chose to respond with something he never showed his victims: compassion. Kor's journey toward forgiveness was long and difficult. For decades after the war, she struggled with anger and hatred toward Mengele and the Nazis who had tortured her. She experienced nightmares, depression, and physical health problems related to her experiences. But eventually, she realized that holding on to hatred was only hurting herself. Her decision to forgive was not about excusing Mengele's crimes, but about freeing herself from the emotional prison they had created. Of the estimated 1,500 twins who were subjected to Mengele's experiments, only about 200 survived the war. Those who lived carried physical and psychological scars that lasted their entire lives. Many developed chronic health problems directly related to the procedures they endured. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they lived when their siblings or fellow prisoners died. The long-term effects of Mengele's experiments continued to impact survivors for decades. Many suffered from chronic pain, vision problems, and other physical ailments directly caused by the procedures they endured. The psychological trauma was equally devastating, with many survivors experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and depression throughout their lives. Some were unable to form normal relationships or have children, fearing that their genetic material had been permanently damaged. The twin experiments at Auschwitz represent one of the darkest chapters in medical history. They show how scientific curiosity, when stripped of ethics and combined with racial hatred, can become a tool of unimaginable cruelty. These weren't rogue experiments conducted in secret. They were part of a systematic program supported by academic institutions and government funding. The institutional support for Mengele's work extended beyond the concentration camp system. German universities provided research funding and academic backing for his projects. Medical journals published preliminary findings from his research, lending credibility to his work. Government agencies coordinated with camp administrators to ensure that Mengele had access to the subjects and resources he needed. This widespread complicity demonstrates how easily scientific institutions can be corrupted when they abandon ethical principles. After the war, Mengele escaped to South America, where he lived under false identities until his death in 1979. He never faced trial for his crimes, never apologized to his victims, never showed remorse for the children whose lives he destroyed in the name of science. But the survivors who lived to tell their stories ensured that his legacy would be one of shame rather than scientific achievement. The twins who suffered under his knife became teachers, showing the world what happens when humanity is abandoned in pursuit of knowledge. Their testimonies continue to echo through history, warning us that the price of genetic secrets should never be paid in human suffering. But there's something else about these experiments that modern scientists are only beginning to understand, something that connects directly to genetic research happening today.